Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am DK Bhattacharya speaking and we'll be talking about environmental archaeology today. In the outset, I must say the word environmental archaeology is a misnomer. It's misnomer because there is no archaeology in it. Basically, since 1963, when Binford brought out his so-called new archaeology, people started paying attention to environment not only for understanding the climatic sequence or paleoclimatic sequence in order to make a tentative dating, but also in order to understand the imperatives of adaptation. Now, there is a little difference, you see, because when you are trying to do, for instance, before Binford, we used to do environmental reconstruction, but they were mainly done in order to fix whether it is a second pluviation, whether it is a first pluviation, in other words, whether it's lower Pleistocene or middle Pleistocene or so on. But we didn't pay attention to whether it was a soggy climate or it was a forested climate. We just wanted to know the paleoclimatic sequence and pin it to a particular date of occurrence. Now, this was possible for a long time until Binford said no. Environment has a very cardinal role to play in giving rise to the shade of culture. If the environment is of a specific kind, the culture that develops is also a little bit different from another environment. So, environment should be studied or reconstructed for the sake of understanding the paleo environment within which man sought adaptation. So, environmental archaeology, therefore, is trying to reconstruct the paleo environment not in order to develop a date bracket for the prehistoric antiquities, but in order to understand the environment within which man sought adaptation. One of the most interesting things that happened and which gave a fillip to environmental archaeology was a man called Emiliani. Emiliani was an Italian scientist and he did very interesting work which is still now being done in a very advanced way. This study of Emiliani is called paleo-temperature curve or reconstruction of paleo-temperature curve. You know what he did? He said that O16 is the normal oxygen and O18 is the isotopic oxygen. And the amount of O18 in the environment is dependent on the environmental temperature. If the temperature rises, O18 becomes less. If the temperature becomes less, O18 becomes more. In other words, O16 by O18, the proportion, is known to change per degree of temperature. So, if you know O16 by O18 in a laboratory and can find out what temperature will cause what kind of O16 by O18, you can predict the temperature of that time. What he did was very interesting. There is a fine foraminifera which floats on the surface of the ocean, and they constantly absorb oxygen from the environment to create calcium carbonate around themselves. Now, the calcium carbonate they create will register the O16, O18 proportion of that time because they're isotopes. So, in physical characters, they won't change. So, the O16, O18 proportion of that particular time when the calcium carbonate was being formed is recorded in the foraminifera or the micro shells, which will be eventually dead and go to the bed of the ocean. Emiliani made deep sea core analysis. You make core of the sea and bring out the levels of dead carbonate of foraminifera, and for each of the level you find out the O16, O18 level. So you find that O16, O18 proportions of the past dead foraminifera can give you the paleo temperature of the past. And lo and behold, what he found was that there were not 4 glaciations as Penken-Bruckner has said, but there were as many as 15 or 16 glaciations. In other words, the temperature dipping of the planet which resulted to glacial period was not only those 4, there were others also. And in fact, after Emiliani's study, we started using the term stadial and interstadial. And stadial means it is a cold period but not cold enough to be the peak of glaciation. That means within a glacial period there will be many peaks, small peaks, and many small depressions. The small depressions will be called interstadials, which means warm but not warm enough to be interglacial. So a classificatory order to understand the paleoclimate was initiated by the study of Emiliani. And this O16, O18 work is still being sophisticated now, and we have now oxygen levels to understand the various climatic phases of the past. Now, this was the first step where we are trying to make an understanding of the past climate without having any tag to chronology. I mean, chronology was not important, reconstruction of the past climate was important. And therefore, we started falling back upon palynology, paleontology, and all the parameters of environmental possibilities, reconstruction, fossil wood, paleobotany, and so on. So we have a huge array of subjects, and I think environmental archaeology is a subject which may be having as many as 50 or 60 subdisciplines. It's a very, very complex and very broad subject which has been brought together under one name by a man called Carl W. Butzer in the year 1970 when he wrote a book called Environmental Archaeology. Frankly speaking, there is no archaeology in it. It means the reconstruction of the past climatic periods. It doesn't even say periods, it says past climates. So you try to reconstruct past climates, and lo and behold, the moment you say past climates, you have climate of different latitudes. You have climates of the Arctic latitudes, you have climates of the mid-latitudes, you have climate of the tropical belt and even the equatorial belt. So reconstruction of the climate of each of the belts immediately gives you the possibility of understanding migration of animals. Migration of animals, the warmth-loving animals, when the glaciation comes, will rush to the equatorial belt. Or the cold-loving animals will rush to the Arctic belt when the warm period comes. So you started chartering the migratory habit of each of the Pleistocene animals, and you started saying these animals will be found in the upper latitudes in the later period and so on. So the tag of chronology was not there. In fact, environmental archaeology in many ways criticized the relative archaeology or relative dating techniques because we found the nitty-gritty of the inner continents or inner differentiation of the climatic variations. Now, these climatic variations have been done under several subheadings. Let us look at three of the subheadings. There are many, and one is the geological process. Of course, we can't do without geological process. And the second is the paleontological process, and the third is the paleobotanical process. These are the same thing that we have used in relative chronology as well. But now this geological process is the process by way of which sedimentation occurs. It has nothing to do with formations. Formations are there, and they are the process of Precambrian or the lava melt, the molten magma solidified and formed the crust of the soil, the earth. We don't talk about that climate. We're talking of the climate after the denudation of these formations, that is the mountains, took place. When the denudation occurs, then parts of the mountain get separated out into depositions. Each of the depositions are caused by various agencies. So if there is an agency called river is geologically defined as a flow of water with a permanent bed. So if you have a river which brings material from a formation, slowly of course in thousands of years, and brings it down to some other place, and there is alluvial deposit, and in the alluvial deposit you have a possibility of analyzing the fluctuation of the river's climatic effect. So if there has been a past climatic effect on the river, the deposition will also change in characters. There is another very interesting deposition which is not really very much talked about because there is no archaeological material found in it, or very little found in it, but it's very interesting. If you have a mountain, and the mountain will have in the daytime hot or daytime sun falling on the stones will create cracks, not in the daytime, but in the night the rock will become little colder. So alternating hot and cold, the surface of the mountain gets tiny cracks, thousands of years. And these cracks slowly come down the slope of the mountain and deposit in the base of the mountain. So they look like as if a bird has been is fallen down with the wings cut. So there are two wings and the mountain in the middle. Now these two wings are called talus, T-A-L-U-S. Talus, and the process by which these pieces constantly come down because of the alternating hot and cold climate, this process is called cryoturbation. CRY. Cryoturbation is the process by way of which there is a natural decomposition of the mountain surface and it creates a deposition. So you have depositions of varied kind. You have talus as a deposition, which is the process is of cryoturbation. You have alluvial deposits, process is, of course, of alluvial river flow. Then you have lacustrine deposit. Lacustrine deposits are deposits were caused by the lake bed. You can have aeolian deposits. Sand of Sahara has been found on 4th floor or 5th floor roof of Paris houses. So you know the sand has come by air. Air has brought them, and it's very simple method of analysis. You look at the grains, if you want to know if it's aeolian or not, and you look at the grains under microscope, and there's a major axis and there is a minor axis. And if you find the major axis and minor axis are, you divide major axis by the minor axis and multiply by 100, then you can say it is a rounding index. And if the rounding index goes beyond 60, then you know it must have come by air and the deposit is aeolian. That is because the air brings it in gushes. It doesn't flow like aeroplane. The sand is brought in a gush and again in another gush. So there is a kind of jumping of this material, and there is a rotation created in the granules, and they create a rounding effect. And the same way you have the sea water going down in some cases and going up. We have recorded 300 feet going down of the sea water. It has been argued, now this process is called eustatic cycle. It has been argued that since the water content in the planet is the same, whether it is in the form of cloud or it is in the form of ice or it is in the form of water, but the total mass of water in the planet is the same. And therefore, when there was glaciation, the large amount of water of the ocean got trapped as ice in the terrestrial region. So since that much of water got trapped in the terrestrial region, the sea level fell. As unlike what normally say sea level never fluctuates, it's not true. We have records of sea level going down to 300, 400 feet from what it is today. And where it goes down, it stays down for hundreds of thousands of years. And then there is a bench created, and it is called a regression beach. Regression beach is the deposit of that level of the water when there was a flowing water level falling down, and the sea level has gone down. Then the record of that lower level of the sea level is found in the form of this beach. So you have regression beach referring to glaciation, and you have transgression beach referring to interglaciation. So regression and transgression beaches are alternating each other, and the phenomena is called eustatic cycle. So you have similar climatic cycles which create all varieties of depositions over the planet. And we are studying these depositions, not only the depositions per se, but also the organic matter contained in the deposition, to see what kind of animals were maintained in what kind of climate. It's a stock sentence we used to use earlier, that glaciation period had only Arctic animals like the Arctic bear and so on. No, there are other animals also who were adapted to the weaker part of the glaciation. Glaciation is a peak, and glaciation also has a weaker part when it is progressing towards interglaciation. So since you have Emiliani's report of 016, 018, you know there is no such thing as 4 grand glaciations. There are so many times the climate went as far, if not farther, than the glacial peaks, that you have to give them different names and give them names of interstadial or stadial 1, stadial 2, stadial 3, and so on and so forth. So for pedagogic reason, it is all right in the classroom to talk about 4 glaciations and 3 interglaciations. But Emiliani was the first who tried to, or why he demonstrated that there seems to be many glacial, or if not glacial, climate going down as far, almost nearly as far as the peak of glacial climate. So you have fluctuation of the climate for all this temperature variation. So paleotemperature curve is a thermometer for understanding the biotic proliferation or the biotic mass of a given ecosystem. And since it is not a large period, since you have many subphases within a glacial and many subphases within an interglacial, you can talk about the biomass that was capable of growing and proliferating in a given period of time. So environmental biology or environmental archaeology will try to reconstruct all these ecosystems. There is one point that needs to be talked about. You see, when we say that man is the only animal who creates a culture, culture means something which is outside the body with which you combat the environment. We have already said that man is the only animal who comes to terms with the environment around him with the help of something which is non-biotic, not in his biotic endowment. He creates from outside, like a stone tool. Now this we have accepted. And if we have accepted that, we cannot forget that environment is the mother of all cultures. Environment caused you to create a shade of culture depending on what shade of environment you chose to adapt in. So we have, wrongly or rightly for a long time, we have been using environment as marker in climatic sequence for relative dating. Environmental archaeology for the first time, because of the support from Binford, who brought in this so-called new archaeology, he brought in the point, why does man behave in a way he behaves? And it was argued that he behaves only because it is the best suited method to adapt in a given environment. So if you have people adapting in Sahara in a particular way, you certainly have to say they have adapted here only because they can survive that way. So environment takes a different meaning when it comes to environmental archaeology. It is not merely a paleoclimatic sequencing in order to get date bracket for your antiquities. Here we don't talk of antiquities, but we can't divide, or you cannot give up antiquities. Because when you're doing an environmental archaeology, you might come across a site, let us say on the slope of a mountain, and a site which is on the top of the mountain. Now you have the whole responsibility then as an archaeologist to talk about the variation in the two assemblages, archaeological debris or debitages in the two systems A and B, and say why they are different. There are also cases where, in spite of the environment being different, they seem to continue with the older tradition. Man is an unpredictable animal. Man does not always depend on environment, and that is why the Herskovits term that was given as environmental determinism was so much criticized in cultural anthropology. Herskovits was almost clear that give me the environmental parameter, I can predict what kind of culture that community will have. They will have sword, they will have wheels, they will have barrows, and so on. We were, all later on, Boasian archaeologists, anthropologists, all criticized it. So I'm not saying that we are becoming environmental deterministic. Now this is the term they use, environmental determinism, that give me the environment, I can predict the culture. We are on the contrary trying to say, if the environment is known, and if there is a culture A in a different environment and a culture B in a different environment, and even then they don't show cultural difference, then that's possible, we accept it, because it is a migratory culture. A culture which has come out of fission of the mother culture. A culture which comes out of fission of a mother culture will not necessarily create a new culture in 1 or 2 generations. Maybe hundreds of generations later on it can create. I give a small example. When Britishers went away from Delhi and India became independent, almost all the positions that the Britishers had was occupied by the Tamilians. Large number of Tamilians came to Delhi. And believe me, there was a train called Madras Janta Express. Half of the bogies of the Madras Janta Express used to be filled with items, vegetables that Tamilians eat. So I'm not saying Tamilians became Punjabis because they came to a new environment called Delhi. They continued with the Tamilian product of raw banana, banana leaves, and blah blahs from Tamil Nadu, specially imported within a new environment. So that shows beyond doubt that environmental determinism is not correct. I'm not saying there is environmental determinism, but that doesn't mean environmental archaeology has to be abandoned. And the environmental archaeology gives you the entire detail of the varieties of environment that was existing in shades of latitudes on shades of cultures. There are some other aspects of environmental archaeology which is also very important, and that's called bioarchaeology by some people. The human skeletons that you get, not from lower Paleolithic, but from later periods, Neolithic onward, they start showing adaptation to a new ecological system. Bioarchaeology is a branch who start looking at the biological effect of adapting to a given environment. Now, if a given environment is chosen by man, and then it will have, of course, if he successfully adapted, then it will show such effects in his biology. I give you an example. If it is not successful adaptation, there will be high rate of infant mortality, and that is an indication of lack of successful adaptation. We call it parity gravity ratio. You take the ratio and immediately you say, no, this community is not well adapted. But the community doesn't know that it is not well adapted, and because of cultural imperatives, it refuses to change. So you find such communities which we refer to as peripheral communities, not mainstream communities, but peripheral communities, where you find they are lingering on despite the fact that they are not well adapted, because there is loss of demographic character, there is a lot of loss of children born, but despite that they will not live it up because of their cultural imperative of generations of adaptation in this area. They will say, no, we will not move from here, but they remain a lag behind in the process of cultural development, and that can explain why even today there are hunter-gatherers. I mean, when Britishers saw the tribals, semi-naked tribals doing hunting-gathering, they always say they missed the bus of civilization. They missed the bus of civilization. They are stupid people. Others got into the bus and became civilized. Now, this is nonsense. They didn't miss the bus of civilization. They were adapted peripherally to ecosystems where they were successful within their biotic mass that they are adapted to, but they never tried to intensify their subsistence base. So they continued to remain, and they were aware of people who were doing agriculture. They were aware of villages. I think even today bureaus go to the villages to beg. So you know that this is a kind of situation where bioarchaeology says that despite the fact that you know that your adaptation is not successful, because you don't know. It is the archaeologists will say the adaptation is not successful. The community will say, no, I have been adapted here for my ancestral period, and I like this theory. So you find in biostatistics or bioarchaeology varieties of adaptational imperatives having impact on the body. I can tell you one thing. The average lifespan of a man in European Upper Paleolithic period was 25 years only. So you can see how wrong those Catholic priests were who said that prehistoric people used to have incestuous relationships. They were cannibals, they were incestuous. Now, this is the way they made a difference between Christians and savages. And you know, if the average lifespan is 25, how can they be incestuous? Now, this shows that the lifespan of the people being so small, there is a very strong imperative of biological repetition or multiplication. And biological multiplication is possible only when you have the access to the biomass, which will give you the subsistence base. So you can make a line of arguments to link the successful communities from the peripheral adaptational communities, from the mainstream communities, depending on your expertise of reconstructing the entire environmental determinations, environmental attributes. So all the attributes needs to be worked out: hydrology, the xerophytes, the palynology. You have to, and it's a tedious job, it's not an easy job. So you try to reconstruct the entire environment, not to create a chronology, but to create that subsistence base, which otherwise is dead and gone. Archaeologists have no access to it. That subsistence base to which a given community has sought adaptation to. And therefore, you can say that the meaning of the adaptational material, that is the tools, starts getting new meaning. These tools now are not merely tools, but they show, maybe because the tools are of this kind, because the environment was of this kind. Once you have an access to reconstruct the environment of a given period, the tools start getting a new meaning. And this is what is environmental archaeology all about. Here I would like to give some examples. Let us look at the cave dwellers in Central Europe or Western Europe. You have Loggery-Haute is an Upper Paleolithic site, Combegrenal is another Upper Paleolithic site. And here you find a huge amount of flesh has been eaten from the mammals, large mammals, and you know they have been hunted. The Solutreans have eaten horse day in and day out. There is so much of horse bones in France that you know that horse was hunted in a very big way. And horse is not easy to hunt because it's a fast moving animal and it's a steppy animal. Now it's a steepy adaptation. The moment you see that horse has been eaten in so many large number, two things become immediately important. That the tools that they developed must have been very successful in hunting horses, number one. Number two, it also shows that the adaptation was in a place which is a steepy land and not a forest land. So, the moment you talk of environmental archaeology, you try to reconstruct the environment that is important for the adaptational success and not for chronology anyway. So, horse-eating Solutreans, or for that matter Magdalenians hunting the mammoths, immediately starts making sense of their successful adaptation. Now let us look at the tools. Now when you look at the tools of Solutrean and Magdalenian, they show no evidence of being specifically designed to hunt these large mammals. Then you start saying, how did they do it? Now this is the first time you can go beyond the tools. You can go beyond the tools to explain a success which otherwise is proved by the bones. And how do? You start looking for the sites where the hunting has been done. And you find that there were ditches in the ground, or natural ditches in the ground, on which dry branches of trees must have been put so that it looks at a contiguous ground, and animals were trapped in it. Such large animals cannot be hunted with puny harpoons. I mean, you go to hunt an animal with a blade and a burin, and the animal will take you and throw you 30 feet away. I mean, even today's elephants, I'm talking mammoths is larger. So here you have a situation where you can go beyond the tools. When you see, yes, I have evidence of so many horses having been eaten, let me look at the tools. Even the drawings, the Solutrean paintings, cave paintings, have a lot of horses. So horse here and a horse there, yet the tools doesn't show any specific manner in which a successful gear of horse hunting has been created. Then you are allowed as an archaeologist to transcend above and propose that they were trapped and not hunted. They were trapped, and when they get trapped and they fall in a ditch, break their bones or break their leg, then perhaps you go with your puny tools to cut it off, or take a stone to crush it, or whatever. But otherwise, there cannot be so much success of large mammal hunting, especially our horses. This is one example. Now let us look at the example from India. Now in India, you do not have a very proper upper Paleolithic. You have a lower Paleolithic continuing in many parts of India. Hand axes and cleavers and choppers and chopping tool continue till the end of Pleistocene. That means the next layer is microlith. And then you start asking, does it mean that they did not hunt large mammals? And you start looking at the mammal bones that you get, and it is true, large mammals were not there. Large mammals were not there in tropical belt. The mammals that were hunted were much smaller. The cow, the buffalo. So the pig was hunted in a big many number. And again you say, sir, does it mean that these middle range mammals that were hunted in the tropical belt led to no such implements which were found in Upper Paleolithic of Europe, and therefore India doesn't have Upper Paleolithic? It starts making sense. It is a very important aspect, environmental archaeology, which starts giving a new meaning to the tools. Otherwise, earlier approach was that we just analyze the tools and said, there you are, this much histogram of core tool, this much flake tool, this much blade tools, and so on. So you analyze the analytical components of the tools, you still can't answer the question, why? And you start getting the meaning of why, though not an empirical level. You have to transcend it above the raw material or the data. And that is why it is a proposition. You cannot prove it. It is a proposition. But then you have the possibility of transcending above the raw material and talk about the possibilistic reasons of variation of tropical toolkit with temperate toolkit. I can give many other examples. We have a very interesting example coming from Bhimbetka. Now Bhimbetka is a cluster of 600, more than 600 rock shelters and caves, which are clustered together at a height of something like 300 to 500 feet above sea level. It's not very high on the top of the mountain. There are some freshwater springs around, and I am sure successful adaptation was possible there. Here you find not large mammals, but small, medium-range mammals have been hunted, but a middle Paleolithic to upper Paleolithic transition has occurred. Then we start looking around, if there is an upper Paleolithic, was there horses hunted? No, the temperate evidence of Solutrean, we find no horses were hunted here. They hunted the pig as usual. Now this is again an example of environmental determinism not to be applicable for humankind. Humankind is very different to be predicted. You can't predict human nature. So here is a development of a culture where you expected a kind of horse hunting because there are upper Paleolithic tools. Bhimbetka has beautiful upper Paleolithic tools. And yet there are no horses. So you cannot really say, and the hunted animals are the pigs, goats and bovids, at the most bovids. You know, cow is a very slow animal. Cow has many problems. Cow cannot survive for more than 3 or 4 hours without water. It's very much dependent on flowing water. It cannot survive without green grass. So it's a pastoral animal and it is very slow. It's not difficult to hunt it. And I don't know how much cows used to be eaten at that time, but certainly we have found cow bones, buffalo bones, which must have been hunted. So here you have a situation which is the environment tells you one kind of situation, the tools defy it. So you say again, sir, we are not following environmental determinism of Herskowitz. We are trying to see what kind of environment can give how many varieties of tool kinds. How many varieties of tool kinds can be given in the same environment or different environment. So it offers a huge amount of possibility, environmental archaeology. Unfortunately, the people who do environmental archaeology are not archaeologists. They're hardcore scientists. They're hardcore scientists with microscopes and labs with reagents and so on. They are doing palynology, they are doing paleontology and so on. So their work is so much in the domain of science, pure science or biological science, that very little archaeological interpretation is possible unless there is a dialogue created between archaeologists and them. We have excellent excavation done by archaeologists in the Egyptian pyramids. And yet we do not know who were the laborers, where were the laborers brought from. Now these are the anthropologist questions. Where were the laborers camped? Where did they eat their food? Who prepared their food? Where was the fire brought for cooking the food? There are galores of questions. Archaeologists are not interested in those questions. They are interested in the height of the pyramid, base of the pyramid, size of the blocks. The antiquity and their analysis preoccupies archaeologists. And here is a chance where environmental biology or environmental archaeologists can come in and contribute and say, well, these were the people, these were the Syrians, these were the Jordanians who were brought as slaves, and they were the ones who used to live in the valley, and the pyramids used to be far away from where they used to be camped. No, there are many questions we don't know. The same questions are for Harappans. We have Harappan metropolis. Harappan metropolis is like Connaught Place. We have truckloads of cow bones. What can you do with cows in Connaught Place? Where will the cow graze in Connaught Place? There are questions we have never addressed. So many cows in a Connaught Place means there must be some grazing ground which is away from the metropolitan site. And these non-metropolitan sites have never been linked up in terms of their environmental archaeology in order to explain archaeological details. So environmental reconstruction can certainly help in understanding archaeology much better way than it has done before. Thank you.